fire arrows invented by the Chinese more than 20 centuries ago were the first ballistic missiles on the planet. In the 18th century, rockets were widely used by standing armies. During the Second World War, the Soviets used the same type of rockets as launchers. The Katyushka, nicknamed Stalin's organ, had a range of 5 kilometers and could be launched in batches of 30 or 40 rockets. None of the rockets developed during the Second World War compared with the German V-2s. These 12-ton rockets contained the same elements as today's missiles: a jet engine, fuel, and liquid oxygen tanks, an automatic guidance system, and an armed nose cone. In 1937, the German army built a large testing center in Peenemünde on the shores of the Baltic Sea, with Werner von Braun as its technical director. The final plans for the V-2 had been completed even before the war had broken out, and the first prototypes were flown in 1942. In the fall of 1944, the first flying bombs bombarded London and the south of England. More than 1,500 V-2s were dropped by the time the war ended. At the end of the war, von Braun and his team surrendered to the Americans, and the V-2 ballistic missile, along with a number of variations still on the drawing board, were absorbed into the American arsenal. On August 6, 1945, a single bomb leveled Hiroshima, and the world tripped into the atomic era. Three days later, Nagasaki met with the same fate. Five days later, Japan surrendered. It had been crushed by a weapon conceived by scientists who were working hand in hand with the military. Bombs quickly became more powerful, sophisticated, and compact. Soon, these bombs were being launched on rockets whose range and power were constantly increasing. After two intermediate-range missiles, Jupiter and Redstone, were developed, the Atlas program was introduced in 1954. Its objective was to build long-range missiles which could fly more than 15,000 kilometers. The first Atlas was operational by 1960. Like the Jupiter and Redstone, the Atlas rocket used a blend of kerosene and liquid oxygen, and could only be fueled minutes before takeoff.
2, 1, fire.
New rockets, such as the Titan II, were designed so a very stable blend of fuels could be used and permanently stored in the rocket's tanks. The Minuteman went even further. It used solid fuels, which didn't have to be handled and could be ignited immediately. This fuel also enabled missiles like the new Polaris to be launched from submarines. The Polaris was replaced by Tridents, which could carry up to 10 nuclear warheads. Missiles have been constantly updated since the 60s. The Minuteman fell into disuse and was replaced by MX rockets, which also had 10 warheads. These rockets are so accurate, they can come within a few hundred meters of their predetermined target, even after traveling several thousand kilometers. Other components of the American nuclear arsenal are equally accurate. Cruise missiles, with their nuclear charge, can practically be placed on the Kremlin's doorstep by remote control. The United States has close to 11,000 nuclear warheads, each of which can destroy a small city. The Soviet Union has more than 8,700 nuclear warheads pointing towards the West. The Soviet nuclear strike force has been developed along lines similar to the Americans. Their slower development of the atomic bomb affected the development of their ballistic missiles. Less sophisticated than American bombs, Soviet warheads were heavier and required more powerful launchers. The parades of missiles in Red Square could lead one to believe that the Soviets were ahead of the Americans in the ballistic missile race. Experts now agree, however, that Soviet nuclear missiles only began to catch up with the Americans at the beginning of the 70s. As soon as their launchers were powerful enough, the military tried to send nuclear charges into space. Placed in low orbit, several kilometers above enemy territory, these warheads could be redirected at any moment and would explode minutes after the command for takeoff was given. Fortunately, such madness has been avoided. In 1967, all the countries signed an international treaty limiting the use of space to peaceful endeavors. The treaty forbids the placing of offensive weapons in space. The enormous power of these strike forces gave rise to the concept of mutually assured destruction. According to this theory, peace is maintained only because conflict would destroy all the parties involved. Such a strategy may seem cynical and extremely expensive. It does, however, guarantee a level of stability or peace by limiting the threat of the apocalypse. The negotiation game is not easy to play, even when the players agree on the basics of a nuclear balance. In September 1972, Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev signed the Arms Limitation Agreement, SALT I. It limited the deployment and testing of new intercontinental missiles for a period of 5 years. In June of 1979, President Carter met with Leonid Brezhnev to negotiate SALT II. The treaty was never ratified, even though the two superpowers did agree to respect the principles set out in the agreement.
The treaty was really nothing but the legitimizing of an arms race. It didn't do anything to reduce
This tacit agreement held up until the summer of 1986, when President Reagan announced the United States would no longer respect it. He claimed the Soviets had abused the treaty, not just once, but several times.
Because it did not reduce weapons.
By announcing the Strategic Defense Initiative on March 23, 1983, President Reagan upset the balance of forces which had lasted for 2 decades.
The Soviets have increased their military power. They've been emboldened to extend that power. They're spreading their military influence in ways that can directly challenge
Mr.
our
Reagan
vital interests.
proposed to replace the strategy of a balance of terror with a shield which would protect America from Soviet intercontinental missiles. This approach is incompatible with the spirit of every treaty the superpowers negotiated during the last 20 years. SDI set the limits for the discussions between Reagan and Gorbachev in Geneva in 1985 and in Reykjavik in 1986. In 1972, the Soviets and the Americans had agreed to limit the deployment of anti-ballistic weapons. Developed in the 60s, these weapons were supposed to destroy nuclear warheads before they could swoop down on their targets. The first such installation had been set up near Moscow in 1968. It consisted of 64 Galosh missiles on 4 sites. They were controlled by radar, which constantly scanned the sky looking for enemy missiles. In 1974, the Americans built a similar defense system near one of their Minuteman bases in North Dakota, but they dismantled it the following year. The first successful American tests of an anti-ballistic missile were carried out on June 10, 1984. A Minuteman, without a nuclear warhead, was launched westward from the Vandenberg base in California. 20 minutes later, an interceptor missile was launched from the Kwajalein Atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The interceptor's infrared guidance system functioned perfectly. The enemy missile was hit and destroyed while in its ballistic flight phase beyond the atmosphere. No matter which system of interceptors is in place, they must work extremely quickly. The race against the clock begins as soon as the missile leaves its underground silo. The booster rocket accelerates when its first 3 stages are ignited, one after the other. The rocket is very vulnerable during this first phase, since it's so easy to pinpoint. The rocket and its nuclear warheads can be destroyed with one shot. This phase lasts only 3 or 4 minutes and less than 100 seconds with the new generation rockets. After completing the initial phase and reaching space, the rocket releases its warheads. No matter how many nuclear warheads each missile carries, it fills the sky with a minimum of 100 decoys, which make interception in the extra atmospheric phase more difficult. This phase lasts 10 to 15 minutes. There's scarcely enough time to separate the warheads from the thousands of decoys and to destroy them before they enter the atmosphere. The warheads then plummet toward their target at high speeds, giving the ground-based missiles less than a minute to intercept them. The objectives of this technology have already been well identified. A permanent surveillance system, which would watch over an enemy strike force, has to be designed and must be put into operation. The system would be based in space and would keep an inventory of enemy missiles, detect launchings instantly, and guide the anti-missile weapons to their target with great precision. The satellites would relay instantly any information to a completely new generation of weapons. The lasers would use mirrors placed either in orbit or on the ground to direct their deadly beams. These powerful guns would be backed up by electromagnetic guns, which would launch thousands of conventional weapons toward any nuclear warheads in a ballistic phase. Beams made up of particles or X-rays, which draw energy from small hydrogen bombs, might also be launched from submarines in the event of a nuclear attack. This technology requires a huge computerized battle management system, which would ultimately coordinate each piece of the puzzle in real time. Despite its infinite complexity, this technology has to work perfectly the very first time it's put to the test. The cost of developing and setting up such an elaborate defense mechanism is one of the Pentagon's most closely guarded secrets. Pundits and experts agree SDI would cost anywhere between 100 and 500 billion American dollars. The Reagan administration expects to spend 25 billion American dollars before the end of 1989, just for the preliminary development of the technology alone. The enormous cost of the project did not prevent former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger from releasing the funds required to set SDI in motion.
A thoroughly reliable system of defense which can render their nuclear missiles impotent.
Curiously enough, the Achilles heel of such a space shield is its own vulnerability. It's increasingly obvious any major conflict between the two superpowers would begin with the destruction of each other's satellites. Anti-satellite weapons have recently been developed by both superpowers. The Soviets' anti-satellite weapon is an SS-9 intercontinental missile. This liquid fuel missile carries a payload weighing 2 tons, which moves slowly toward the targeted satellite. The rendezvous maneuvers, which can take several hours, allow the satellite to get close enough to its victim to incapacitate it with a volley of steel balls. The inflexibility of such an interceptor does not seriously threaten the American military satellites at present. Over the last 10 years or so, the Americans have been developing a completely different anti-satellite weapon. A small 2-stage rocket, it's launched into space from an F-15 fighter aircraft. The rocket carries a small payload weighing 15 kilograms. The capsule contains 8 telescopes, which can detect the infrared radiation of the target and determine the point of contact. Again, it is the collision of the two machines which destroys the target. The advantage of the American system is that it's cheaper and more versatile than its Soviet counterpart. The American anti-satellite missile was tested several times since January of 1984. It functioned adequately and can be considered operational.
9, 8, 7. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery, the first flight totally dedicated to Department of Defense mission. And it's cleared the tower.
Tower clear. The vehicle now turning around to the proper azimuth. Go down track on this flight.
The Space Shuttle Discovery completed its first exclusively military operation in January 1985. Even though the Pentagon made every effort to keep the objectives of the mission secret, it was discovered that an electronic spy satellite had been launched. It was supposed to pick up Soviet military communications and relay them to American receiving stations.
36,000 feet. 0.7 mark on the heading alignment circle.
A mission in June of 1985 was more closely linked with the development of SDI. The Challenger accident in January 1986 seriously hindered the completion of the project, which was to have been carried out over 10 or more missions.
1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical.
Down to only 3 vehicles, the American shuttle fleet had a great deal of trouble meeting the deadlines set by the military. The shuttle, however, is essential to the SDI program. The Pentagon, relying heavily on the shuttle, had to reevaluate its entire strategy. It was increasingly clear that the 3 available space shuttles did not have the flexibility or availability to satisfy the military. To avoid being at the mercy of the shuttle, the Pentagon ordered a new series of conventional launchers. These launchers will be used on missions where passengers are not essential. The military also announced it'll abandon the launching installations built for the shuttle at Vandenberg Base in California, at least for the moment. As for President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, it's difficult to predict whether it will survive its inventors. The obstacles facing the defense system are neither military nor strategic, but technological. It seems that a nuclear war, which can have no winner, will remain the best guarantee for peace on the planet for a few years to come.
Volgende week gaat het niet over de aarde, maar over de andere planeten, zoals Venus en Mars.